Hello everyone, this is the second part of the topic conditions required for the cross pollination. We have already talked about the 2 points, that was the first one was the unisexuality in the flower that tends to cross pollination. Unisexuality means the flower may be either male or either female. For that they need to do cross pollination between the male plant flower and between female plant flowers. So the second point was the dichogamy, in which basically the maturation time of the stigma and stamen should be same for the cross pollination. Now the third term says that self sterility. Here the sterile means any organism or any flower that do not tends to reproduce their offspring. Basically in flowers this is a condition in which even if the stigma receives the pollen from the anther of the same flower, but pollen fails to undergo further growth, and this term known by the term basically self sterility. Here the term self means the in between the same flowers. If you take an example of a sunflower ray floret, basically the sunflower is divided into two flowers. The first one is between the black disc, this is the first flower, and the floret surrounding it. These are basically the ray florets of the sunflower. We are talking about the ray florets that are basically sterile. That means they can't go or they can't reproduce their or undergo their pollen grains for the further growth. Now the fourth term, that is the hercogamy. Basically the hercos means the barrier, or we can also say any structural or mechanical changes that tends to form a barrier between the male and the female part for further pollination, or we can say fertilization. Basically hercogamy is a term in which some flowers the pollen of a flower cannot reach the stigma of the same flower. For example, if you take an example of a pansy flower, these are basically brighted colored small flowers. They have a hood covering of the stigma, act as a mechanical barrier in pansy flowers. Basically these barriers avoid the pollination. Basically the flowers are look like this is the center part, basically this is the stigma, and above it it is covered by a hood like structure, and this covering avoid the pollen grains to enter into the stigma and to do pollination. Now the fifth term, that is heterostyly. These heterostyly are basically in such flowers the stigma and the anthers grow at a different height. If you see the diagram here, these are basically two flowers in which this one is the anther, the male reproductive organ, this one is the stigma. As we are able to see here that the anther and the stigma is at the different heights, so the pollination is basically they do not favor self pollination, so they need to do cross pollination between different flowers of the different plant of same species. In the second diagram we are seeing that the stigma is shorter than the anther. So the heterostyly is basically the stigma and the anther grow at different height. For that they can't able to do self pollination, so therefore they need to do cross pollination. Now we are going to talk about the agents of cross pollination, how the pollens are transferred from one plant of the flowers, basically the flowers pollen grains, to the another flowers stigma. Now these agents are responsible for the pollination of the cross pollination. Basically there are two common agents of this cross pollination. The first one is the insects and the second one is the wind. Now if you are thinking about the insects, we need to understand that the flower might be bright in color, or they have nectaries inside it for the attraction of the insects. In wind pollination, flowers has to produce more pollen grains as compared to the self pollination. Now in some flowers the pollination also occurred or also done by the birds. The pollination done by the bird are basically known by the term ornithophily. Basically, the ornitho terms is related to the birds only. This ornithophily means the pollination, or we can say the cross pollination that is done by the birds is called ornithophily. And sometimes in rafflesia, basically the rafflesia is the largest flower in the world. These are basically found on the basically the Thailand, in the Thailand. These flowers are basically very large in size, so sometimes these flowers do cross pollination with the helps of elephants. Now these elephants pollination terms known by the name elephantophily. Now in the next part of the video we are going to talk about in the brief about the insect pollinated flowers, wind pollinated flowers and the other animals pollinated flowers. Till then, thanks for watching.